Hello, I'm Greg Ip. I am the chief economics commentator of the Wall Street Journal, and today I'm talking to Geeta Gopinath, who is the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. Geeta is going to walk us through some research that she and her colleagues at the fund have done on the uh, effects and spread of the pandemic to date and what we can expect in terms of the economic picture going forward. Hello, Geeta. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Greg. Thank you.
All right, so Geeta, first of all, tell us about how far the pandemic has spread thus far and where it's headed.
So you see this on the first slide, which is if you look at the path of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, it started out, its epicenter was China. It peaked in China in February, and the number of cases have come down quite dramatically. And then it moved on to Europe, and it's moved on to the US, where you are seeing the big hit now. I think there's two things to take away from this chart. One is that emerging markets are at an early stage, excluding China, are at an early stage in terms of the epidemic. So that hasn't rolled around there as severely. And second, that containment measures can work, at least what we're seeing in the data, in terms of the number of cases in China and how they've come down recently.
Can you tell us anything from these charts about when we can expect the peak to come in the United States and Europe and when it's likely to occur in the emerging world?
So this is what we learn from epidemiologists. I'm not an expert on this, but what we obviously hear is that, in this week or 2 weeks, there are going to be many parts of the US where it would peak. That's what the epidemiologists tell us. I think there is still tremendous uncertainty about the path of the virus. Now, their expectation is that these containment measures will work in a durable way, but that's not guaranteed. It could be that some of these places where the number of cases came down, so see a resumption in this virus later on. And so there is a lot that we don't know at this point here.
And isn't it also a function of healthcare system capacity? And what does that bode for emerging markets?
Indeed, this is a very important vulnerability for emerging markets, which is that if this were to come around, it must be as severe as what we're seeing in Europe and the US, in many of these other emerging markets, then the lack of very strong health systems is going to exacerbate the problem there.
So after China, I guess the first and hardest hit economy was Italy. Very, rapid and a severe rise in the epidemic there. What do we know about Italy's experience thus far, and what does that tell us about what the rest of the world could expect?
So this is the next next slide that we have on Italy and what we've seen over there. What you see is two charts actually. One for the impact of the lockdown in Italy on attendance at public places and on electricity use. And it's divided by the center north and the center south. So there were many more infections in the center north. And you can see a plummeting of activity in terms of both electricity, in terms of attendance at public places, as opposed to the center south, where the number of infection rate has been slightly lower. Again, I think what's important to take away from this chart is why this is a crisis like no other, which is the speed with which you've seen the hit on economic activity and magnitude of that hit in such a short period of time. This comes when you have lockdowns in a country. And this is not something that we have seen in a long, long time. This is way, much stronger in terms of magnitude than the global financial crisis.
What have we seen in terms of other countries vis-a-vis following or not following the path of Italy? So, I mean, Italy is perhaps one profile that other countries may be following, but are there other worse or better profiles out there?
So there is variation. There are a bunch of countries that are following Italy's profile. There are some that are worse in terms, if you look at the famous charts on coronavirus cases, active cases around the world, the trajectories, for instance, in the US looks a little steeper. And then there are countries like South Korea where it looks flat. There are different strategies that have been followed in these different parts of the world. There are, of course, different kind of demographic features in these different parts of the world. These factors play an important role, and it does impact what shape this particular, how many infections happen, when the peak happens. All of this is dependent on policies that are being put in place.
in the last few days, we've actually had a glimmer of hope out of Italy. The number of deaths has started to go down. There's some sign of a peaking and trend down in new cases. I'm going to ask you to go out on a limb here, Gita. How long before you think that could translate into a revival in economic activity in Italy?
So I'm going to show you a chart that later on comes up for China. And of course, I don't think this comparison is direct. But one of my last slides shows you that there has been, after the peak, after it came down in March, we are seeing a glimmer of hope in China. We are seeing a resumption in activity. I'll come back to that chart. But before that, I wanted to spend a minute on this slide on the US, which again is another example of the speed of this crisis. If you see the number of jobless claims that have been put in this last 2 weeks, totaling 10 million, it's just unparalleled. And this is the kind of features of this crisis which make it so unique.
Yeah, that is pretty horrific. I think we're talking about, what, 10 million claims filed just in the last few weeks. What is that likely to translate into in terms of unemployment? And perhaps just as important, how long do you think unemployment could stay high? And how important is it that we start to get the unemployment rate to come down in the medium term?
So what these numbers imply that there's going to be a big hit to growth in the US in the second quarter. And this is going to be true across the board for many of these advanced economies and in fact, many emerging markets. We're looking at big drops in the growth rate and deep recessions in many countries. Now, this is again a unique feature of this crisis and why it's like no other, is because this is a period where we actually do not want to be stimulating activity and getting people to go out there. I mean, the advice is to stay at home. So to that extent, policy plays a stabilizing role. The hope is that if these containment measures are effective and we start seeing a decline in the number of cases and the death rate, the number of deaths, then we will see a resumption in activity, maybe in the third and the fourth quarter of this year.
Do you have a view on whether the nature of the job loss matters here? So, for example, does it matter if firms go bankrupt and permanently sack their workers versus firms are able to hang on and simply issue temporary layoff orders?
Well, it always helps not to break up matches, right? It takes a while to match a worker to a firm. It takes a while to have a firm up and running. And so the ideal scenario is where policies prevent these kind of scarring effects on the economies, where people lose jobs and it's hard for them to get back into the job market, or for firms to go bankrupt and therefore make it difficult for it to start. So I think that has to be an important priority, is to make sure that these web of relations stay as intact as possible, so that once we are past this phase and there's some control over the disease, the recovery can happen much more quickly.
Okay, so your next chart now shows us manufacturing activity in February versus March in a variety of economies. What is that telling us about the path of the economic shock?
What it's telling you is that even in emerging markets that have not been hit directly by the epidemic in a very severe way, they are experiencing the spillover effect from a drop in demand in advanced economies in Europe and in the US. And so you see a significant decline in manufacturing activity and some really dramatic drops. The second thing to take away is that in the case of China, February was really bad. But with the decline in the number of cases and a return to work, there's been some improvement. It's in manufacturing activity in China. We're not getting back to trend there, but it is an improvement. But again, I just want to highlight that for emerging markets, they're seeing the negative effect from the rest of the world. And the question is, it is a real risk of what happens if there is a full-blown epidemic in all of these different economies too, then the effects would be even larger.
So in your last slide here, you have an interesting picture of China in February versus March. What is this telling us about the path of the economic activity there in the wake of the crisis?
Well, that picture is just confirming that there's been an improvement in activity, even when you look at it from space, which is that if you look at satellite data and a measure of nitrogen dioxide concentration in the air, you can see that in March, there's clearly a resumption in industrial activity in terms of more mobility, more travel happening as opposed to in February. So, I mean, we want to end with a cautiously, hopeful note that this health crisis will end, that with the appropriate health measures being taken, we can see the world economy turning around. And of course, again, I would also flag that there remains a lot of uncertainty of the path forward, but there is some hope. And we should keep in mind that to make sure that there is an appropriate level of recovery, that it will require global cooperation. It's not just enough for national governments to do what they can, but it will require a great deal of international support. And at the IMF, we've really stepped up and we're doing everything we can.
Okay, I'd like to ask one final question here, which is that one of the great success stories in economics of the last 20 to 30 years has been the dramatic reduction in poverty around the world. Is this pandemic and the related economic shock going to reverse some of that progress? And if so, what's the best way to mitigate it?
So Greg, indeed, this is going to be a very deep crisis in many economies of the world. There will be deep recessions, there will be deep drops in growth. What that means is that for a large number of people, especially those who live on daily income, there will be an immediate loss of income. Right? I mean, they will not earn whatever it is that they earn on a daily basis. And this is the specific feature of this crisis, which is when you put the country in a lockdown, these poorer people get affected dramatically from it. What this means is that it's important, it's very, very important for country governments to ensure that while incomes have been lost, consumption is not lost, healthcare is not lost. And therefore, there have to be very direct targeted policies to help them through cash transfers in countries with more formal sector, wage subsidies, unemployment insurance, and all of this is really essential and it has to be done urgently now.
Very enlightening discussion. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Greg, for this interview.